Welcome back to another episode of the Contrarians. This is the third episode in a new concept we're doing, one that was like hitting us in the face. Tim and I were talking about this and thinking, okay, well, we've had the regular Contrarians concept where we have all those early core episodes where like someone on the team has to pick a Contrarian choice for their favorite album and then have to defend it. We called that being on the hot seat about it. But then we got to thinking, well, what about just the band's own Contrarian album? Like, what's a Contrarian album in the catalog? Taking our opinion out of it, more of an analysis of what is an out of character album. Why is it out of character? Is it something to do with trend? Is it something to do with panic at not being commercial enough? What are the reasons that they made a Contrarian album? And today we're going to look at the band Def Leppard. Tim's got a choice for the most Contrarian album. He's gonna tell us about it. And then once this is all done, let us know in the comments what you think of this choice. And he might even have a little bit of an honorable mention for you after he's done. But Tim, take it away. What is the most Contrarian Def Leppard album?
Thanks, Martin. The topic was so obvious that we missed it for such a long time. Yeah. It's not our opinion. It's the album saying we're way different. So I came prepared. I've got my Def Leppard Rock Brigade shirt
nice. On. And I'm sporting Amorphous today. So there we go. The polar opposite.
Close enough. Yeah. So I think that most people would agree. And that's what's great about this episode is it doesn't necessarily have to be an opinion that's unpopular. Mm-hmm. It's the album itself. It's Slang, 1996. And actually this is as well. This is a limited edition one. It's got an acoustic CD on it. I never opened it. I have heard the CD. Yeah, this came out, it came out around this time of year. I believe it came out in May of 1996. And it is far and away the most un-Def Leppard sounding album. To the average listener, if you think about the things that make that band sound like Def Leppard, you'd think the stacked vocals, you'd think the really smoothed out guitars, you'd think the electronic sounding drums and the big choruses. None of that, absolutely none of that is present on this album. They recorded it, and it's escaping me now, but somewhere in warmer temps, they set up in a villa somewhere and recorded this album. Very stripped down, extremely stripped down. I'm not sure. I don't know if they produced this themselves with like Pete Woodruff or Mike Shipley or one of them. Might have been Pete Woodruff. But I think in a lot of ways, it was about the only thing that they could have done in 1996 because Adrenalize came out in early 1992. I think it was about 2 years too late. They still managed to sell 3-4 million copies, but it really stood out like a sore thumb in that time period, and they were kind of a laughing stock, even though they had their fan base, people like me. But I remember even when Let's Get Rocked came out, I remember hearing that and go, "Oh, really? Is that what you're going to come out with after this long in this time period, guys? Come on!" And I just kind of looking around, going to the store and like, hope nobody sees me buying this. but yeah, Slang. It's really about the only thing that they could have done. Now, I will say this. A lot of bands, as we've talked about and Martin's discussed on History in 5 Songs, I wouldn't say this is their grunge album. It's probably the closest thing to it, but it's not grungy, I don't think. It is darker in tone musically and definitely lyrically. The lyrics are, a little bit more down to earth. But it is a very, very different sound. I mean, for one thing, I believe, I'm not sure how some of this was done, but I believe Rick Allen actually sat behind an acoustic kit and played, which would have been the first time he had done that in a good long time. I'm not even sure he did that on Pyromania, but they came out with an album that only went gold in the U.S. It did go platinum in Canada. That's a little bit different sales figures, and I think it did fairly well in other parts of the world. But listening to it now, I didn't really like it at all when it first came out. I've grown to really like some of the songs on here. I think that the first track, Truth, is kind of a cool song. And that song, I don't get grunge vibes from it. I get almost little hints of like Nine Inch Nails, little hints of industrial on that one. So they were definitely trying to go with different influences. I will say one of the best things I can say about this album is that this came out long before they got this urge to sound new country. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea. And then there's nothing what I would call really pop on here. The two best known songs on it would be the first single, Work It Out, which doesn't sound at all like a Def Leppard song. Joe sings in a very low register. And it was a song that was brought in by Vivian Campbell. I think it was Vivian's first major songwriting contribution to the band. Now, it was a hit in some parts of the world. I actually think it did fairly well here in Canada. And the title song, Slang, is their first attempt at incorporating some of the hip hop. It's a fun song live. It's a little confusing on the album because it doesn't sound like anything else. One of my favorite songs on here is the song Deliver Me, which is it's almost heavy. It's not recorded heavy, but it's sinister and dark. And I remember Phil Collins saying it was inspired by Bring on the Night by the Police, which is about the killer Gary Gilmore. Gift of Flesh is another heavy one. There are still ballads on here, and I find the ballads are the most boring parts of this album, like All I Want Is Everything, Breathe a Sigh, Blood Runs Cold, Where Does Love Go When It Dies? Like when they're not, the songs that don't seem to have much of a pulse, that's when I kind of veer off. And the last song, Pearl of Euphoria, which is oddly enough, Euphoria is what they called their next album, which sounds nothing like this, is this long, drawn out. I'm sure they were making an attempt at something artistic, but it goes on too long. So I probably like 40% to half of this album, but none of it sounds like Def Leppard. You know, you can listen, you can say, yeah, that's Joe Elliott singing, but the background vocals aren't there. The guitar doesn't sound like Def Leppard. You know, there's just nothing intrinsically Def Leppard about this. But like I said, it's about the only album they could have put out in the mid-90s. It really is, because if they'd have put out another Adrenalize, that probably would have been the end of their career, because it hadn't shifted back. Towards the end of the 90s, there was more of a nostalgia for the 80s sounding bands. There was a big nostalgia for it around 1999, and the Guitar World started putting out, special issues, the best hair metal albums, Motley Crue on the cover. But it hadn't happened yet. 96 was a bad time for a lot of these bands, even bands that were as successful as these guys were. So if they hadn't have put this album out, I think the only thing that they could have done is just waited it out, is just sat back and waited for it to come back around again, not unlike what Poison did. But when you have sold that many albums, there is expectation. And I'm sure the contract said, we need another album from you guys. So, I admire them for doing something really risky, really different. And when you look in modern sales terms, this album didn't flop. But compared to a 10 million selling album and like a 17 million selling album, it was a huge flop. It ended up, I don't think I ever saw it in the delete bins. I just never saw it that much. So it's an album that you can even now put on. And, if you're really, really into the band, well, if you're really into the band, you know it. But if you're only familiar with the hits, you might say, well, the singer kind of sounds like the guy from Def Leppard, but I don't know who this is. So it doesn't have any of the band's identity on it. So, yeah, that is definitely my pick for the most contrarian sounding Def Leppard album. They don't even use the logo, except on one little on the back here. It's the only time they use the logo. So, yeah, very different sounding album and very much of the times. I don't think this album would have come out 2 years earlier or 2 years later.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree that it also, that short narrative of it being their grunge album doesn't really apply. I mean, Work It Out is the one that was like the front facing song, and it's probably the grungiest song on it, and it's good. And what I like about this record is the more thoughtful lyrics, the better chord sequences, the better chord changes. It's not as saccharine as everything else they'd been doing. And again, to getting away from the primary colors and the ridiculous triangle logo and all that, and doing this was pretty cool. And I like the title too, Slang. So you're right. It's pretty interesting. They kind of had to do this. They had to do something serious, but rather than saying it's the grunge album, I mean, it picks up a few of those elements, but it also picks up, unfortunately, it picks up the mechanized hip hop beat thing that we're going to start seeing later as well. And it's really not and like you say, it's really not particularly heavy either. It's funny that it is the most contrarian one, but there are strands of it that also perform a little bit of an evolution. I don't know. What would you say is the honorable mention as the second most contrarian Def Leppard album?
Well, yeah, if Slang didn't exist, I would have gone with the debut, On Through the Night. And because this album doesn't sound like anything that came after it. Now, it's almost unfair to call a band's debut album Contrarian because it's a brand new band. But starting with High and Dry, they changed so drastically from that first album. I mean, this first album has things like When the Walls Came Tumbling Down and Answer to the Master. I mean, those are almost gothic. Those could almost be Maiden songs. They never did that again. That was, and there's nothing other than Hello America. There's nothing particularly poppy on here. They hadn't gotten the harmonies yet, although I think they sang quite well together on here for such a young band. It was hooky, but it just wasn't the same as what came after. And there are some pretty heavy riffs on here, like Wasted and Satellites of, kind of a rockin' When It Could Be You. So yeah, this would definitely be the second one, but there are elements of what they would become on this album, particularly with the harmonies. This one is so dry and stripped back that it was almost a complete reinvention. So I think more than anything, Slang will remain the most contrarian sounding Def Leppard album.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And I would agree on the first one. And then I'd maybe bring in XXX as well, because I remember how shocked we were at how poppy that was when that came out at the time. But the debut, and the funny thing about the debut I always talk about is how it is the mean median average right at the middle of the the bike wheel of spokes of the new wave of British heavy metal. It is so absolutely perfectly square on dead center a new wave of British heavy metal album. And then the irony is that Joe Elliott dismisses the new wave of British heavy metal and says, "Oh, we were never part of it," sort of thing, which is kind of funny because it is really like that. But I agree with your point too. It's hard to like pick a debut as the contrarian choice of a band. But we may as this series goes on find examples of debuts that are incredibly radically different from what went on, that they may come up or at least get the second slot as honorable mention. So there you go, folks. Let us know what you think about this whole Def Leppard situation. Is Slang the most contrarian album? Let us know if there are other choices. Let us know if there are other bands you want us to talk about in this series of the most contrarian album by a band, and we'll take it from there. But for now, go play some Slang and let us know what you think.